First, I want to introduce our professor today. She's Marlese von Broembsen. Sorry if I misspelled your name. She is a law program director of WeGo. As most of you know, WeGo is an international organization that helps workers, especially women, in the formal economy. So we are going to go ahead with the first question, and then I'm going to open for question for the participant. My first question, I know that you are a lawyer, but how can, according to your experience, how can trade unions compel brands to introduce a clause in their commercial agreement by which supplier must disclose the name of the brands, and inform the workers about their labor rights? How can union push in that regard? Thank you.
Well, thanks, Luis, and hi, everybody. Great to connect with all of you. So yes, Luis, you're quite right. I'm a lawyer, not a trade unionist, and I know Benjamin is a trade unionist, so he's on this call, and so he may have better ideas. So I guess the first offering I would make is that it's not so much about a trade union putting pressure on a brand within an individual context, but it's about trade union pressure for legislation that puts that duty on the brands to do that. So we have one example globally, which was mentioned in the brief that I wrote, which is in Australia, and in particular in North South Wales. So the obligation is slightly different. In that legislation, the obligation is that on the brands put a contractual provision in the contracts with their suppliers, that the suppliers have to ask every tier in the chain to report on home workers in the chain. So every tier reports up until the supplier reports to the brand, and the brand has to then report both to the trade union movement as well as to the government. And that legislation was because of trade union pressure. And the trade union then is involved in the enforcement mechanism. So the reporting is done to the trade union, but the trade union can also go and do inspections. And so I think a similar thing in terms of legislative framing, trade union pressure for legislation, could be done for a similar kind of provision, that there's an onus on the suppliers to make sure that all workers know about their rights in the brand. In the supply chain. I guess two other things to respond to that. I mean, the one is, there is in the OECD due diligence, in the OECD instrument, there is a requirement for the brand to be making sure that all the workers know what their rights are in terms of the OECD instrument. And so I think that's a leverage also with respect to brands. And then finally, of course, we're concerned about the legislation in the EU. I think this would be a question for people like Benjamin, whether it's possible for trade unions in supplier countries, particularly those that are members of Industrial or of the ITUC, to be putting pressure on European trade unions to make sure that that's in the EU legislative framework.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Now I'm going to give the opportunity to the participants to ask if they have some question. Please raise your hand. Please, Benji, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Luis, and hi, Marlese. Great to see you again. Yeah. I'll go first. I'll relate something, and maybe you can make any comments, and then of course further if you have any suggestions. Right, Marlese knows that I work with workers in supply chains, many of them in garments. Right. What usually happens is that in the export processing zones, there's like low road human resource management, right? So not not very compliant, union busting is prevalent, right? So what usually happens is that having known that brands have promises about compliance in their supply chains, workers try to engage with brands. So first thing they do is, of course, they try to know what the brands they supply to. In garments, they usually know because they can very well see it when they assemble the apparel. In electronics, sometimes that's not easy because unless it's a finished product, right? They can very well see it, but if they're just making small parts, then it becomes very difficult. So what was happened in the experience I know is that workers, through the help of NGOs, local and trade unions, and then even international NGOs and groups, they try to reach out to brands. And what happens at the factory level is that the management pushes back. They file cases against workers, saying that workers are destroying the name of the company by reporting to the brands. So what happened? So the workers were expecting that they'll get some remediation. What happens is that it seems apparently their conditions become worse because now they have to face either administrative cases at the factory level. We will also had a case where factories were threatening that they will file libel cases against the local union and also those labor organizations that are helping the workers. So any ideas about things that are like this that are happening?
Wow. So I mean, I would just ask that we have a conversation rather than seeing me as the expert. You know, I mean, I'm sitting in South Africa, in Cape Town. So I mean, I guess the two thoughts I've got is one is around whistleblower protection and whether that's something that we should be thinking about as a labor movement. And, you know, there's sort of whistleblower protection at the EU level, and is that something people have been discussing around whether that should be incorporated into the mandatory due diligence legislation? I don't know what that's like at a local, national level. But the other question I would have, and just as a clarification question, is on what basis would they be suing workers? You said they were bringing proceedings of liability against workers who were complaining to brands. I mean, what would the basis be for that?
Well, at the factory level, so they file administrative cases against the workers that they basically were discrediting the company. That's what so it's management against the worker, right? So they very well have the advantage at that level. On the other hand, we've also had cases where the management were sent letters to labor organizations saying that take down the post that are on social media naming companies that are violating or allegedly violating labor laws. Yeah. Of course, as far as I know, the labor groups didn't take it down. They just waited if any lawsuit will be filed, but they of course never did. So apparently it was just harassment.
So I mean, I think these are political questions of political power. I'm not sure that law can solve it. And as you know, law is only as strong as the political power that backs it in terms of enforcement. I mean, I would be curious to know what you think of the EU legislative framework that we're expecting, whether you think how that might be applied at the national level. And I also ask that because, so we, as WeGo, so just to say we are supporting informal workers, but we're a global member of the Clean Clothes Campaign. And the Clean Clothes Campaign, I mean, as you know, is one of the 8 civil society organizations that are Brussels-based and that kind of have the ear of the Commission and are lobbying very hard in terms of the Commission. And so, I sit on one of the working groups where we're engaging with this process. And so I think what would also be helpful in this session is to hear, what do you think at national level should go up to the European level? That would be helpful. So, one of the things you've discussed is the whistleblowing idea, but and the second would be that people know who the brand is, but it would be helpful to know what are some of the other ideas. And do you think it's yeah, let me leave it at that. So can I turn the question back to you, Benjamin?
Yeah, so that was my fear that you were asking me. So, well, in terms of whistleblower, I don't think there's any whistleblower protection for workers. Although I think we had a chance here to talk to the National Human Rights Institution in the Philippines. It's called the Commission on Human Rights. They have something similar to whistleblower protection for human rights defenders. So it's possible to pursue that. But that in that particular cases that I mentioned, we didn't. The workers didn't pursue that option. What they did was they did the right action. They went on strike. That's actually what happened in that case. And then finally the dispute gets settled because of the strike. So like they overstepped that dispute by going on strike. That question about administrative cases against the workers. And then
so
the problem, I think,
industrial action rather than
yeah. So that's for that particular case at least. Although here, of course, we're of the idea that I think it's best to combine. Of course, those laws may not be as robust, right, or as strong in being enforced, but still it provides some arena or platform for the workers to increase their leverage. So, whenever I'm able to talk to workers, I tell them there are these certain laws, there are these opportunities, so might as well use them, right? In terms of I think the problem here in the Philippines, most of the suppliers come from or locator factories or investors from Korea or Taiwan or Japan, some from the US, but very little in terms of the EU. Although every now and then they supply to the EU, right? So there's that opportunity, and then there's this GSP Plus in the Philippines. So I think that's one point of leverage, at least to the government, that the government does something in terms of enforcement and compliance in the export processing zones.
Thank you, Benji and Marlese. I just want to make a quick comment that in some countries there is this process of criminalization of the protest. No, it's like filing criminal cases against unionists. No, and so maybe in this regard, in the human rights due diligence, also it could be an obligation not only inform about their labor rights, but also about that worker has all human rights, like freedom of expression, no? And that is my comment is in regard to this comment in the chat about Rona Hill say that also some worker, when they post in Facebook, no, against the company or against the management, they face retaliation, no? So we are in a situation when companies don't respect labor rights, but also sometimes they don't respect just basic human rights, not like your freedom of expression. So maybe that could be also part of this approach, no? So, well, I would like to know if there is another question. Please raise your hand. Well, you think in your question, maybe I can go ahead with my second question. Is according to your experience, Marlese, how much progress has being made so far to create these gender sensitive complaint mechanisms? No, you mentioned that in your video lecture, and I think it's an important approach. Here in Americas, we just have a opinion, advisory opinion for the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights that talk about labor rights with a gender approach. No, and this is a very important document that put in a advisory opinion, clarification about that important. You know? So I would like to know if there is progress in you, as you know, to share with us about these gender sensitive complaints and mechanisms.
Thank you, Luis. The one that I know about, which is the one that we mentioned, is the one in Lesotho. The other that I think is very interesting approach is the Asia Floor-Age Alliance approach to gender-based violence in supply chains. And in fact, I'm going to just post a little, it's called the Safe Circle approach. I'm going to quickly see if I can, I've copied it. I'm going to just post it in the chat. There it is. So for those of you that don't know, so the Asia Floor-Age Alliance was initially created by the New Trade Union Initiative in India. And it's an alliance across several Asian countries. And they've really got 3 pillars of work. So the one was and this was the founding piece, which is around the living wage. And the recognition that if each country is battling on its own, the brands just move to another country. And so there was a need for a regional living wage. And we can go into that. That's a separate discussion, I guess. The second area was around freedom of association. And the third was gender-based violence. So in the context of gender-based violence, I think, the one thing is, of course, I don't think that a complaints mechanism on its own is going to change a lot, in the sense that we're still relying on workers to have the confidence to go to the complaints mechanism, and we're still putting the onus on the workers to change the culture in a supply chain. So what they do is there are 2 things. The one is that they've created a women's leadership committee. And this is where women themselves are negotiating with brands, directly with brands. And that's as a kind of empowerment model. But the second is what they call the Safe Circle approach. So it's an approach particularly to address gender-based violence. And it's at the factory level and it's at the national level. And you can read more about it in that piece that I've just pasted in the chat. And so at the factory level, as I understand it, it's women sit on these committees, but they're also supervisors that sit on the committees. And the aim is both to shift the consciousness of both the supervisors and the women of what gender-based violence is. So it often just starts off as low-level harassment until it becomes something much more serious. And they together devise reporting mechanisms and how to sort of eradicate that, and disciplinary measures within the factory. So that for me is a very interesting approach too, and it will be interesting to hear people's comment on that.
Thank you for sharing that. I would like to know if there is any comment or question from the participants. Not yet. Well, I have a comment. Oh, please go ahead, Honey.
Hi, Marlese. Thank you for doing this with us. I was listening earlier about a comment on whistleblower protection and the importance of that. And what that reveals to me is that it's really important to really look into the design of these laws and making sure that there are built-in mechanisms to make these laws potent and very powerful. So I was just wondering, and in relation to that, I felt that the the knowing of the brand names is very crucial for workers, and the linking of the workers in their, I mean, the linking of the, say for example, home worker, home-based workers in relation to their the companies, big companies in the global north, is the linking of the two is so important. So I was just wondering whether in some of these laws in the global north, whether there are provisions, I mean, in terms of naming, disclosing the brands, does it always have to rely on self-reporting for these companies to in their under contracts? Or maybe I was just exploring how might it would look like if, for example, there is a built-in mechanism in these laws which sort of consolidates a database for these companies that would disclose, I mean, that would have some sort of listing for their companies, and like disclosing where their where are the where their home-based workers are located elsewhere in the world. I mean, who usually does that reporting? Is it a sort of an NGO, or are there instances where laws really require these companies to publicly disclose their brands and where they're like sort of subcontracting their products? Thank you.
Yeah, so honey, I mean, those are really important questions that you raise, and they're very close to my heart because we work with home-based workers. So just for you, those of you that don't know, WeGo is a network of organizations of informal workers, and one of the occupational groups are home-based workers, including home workers in global and domestic supply chains. And so, honey, the issue raising around design is so crucial. And the piece that I wrote is really the home-based workers. So we're working across 14 countries, and knowing that the human rights due diligence legislation that is being so sorry, let me take one step back. So as a member of the Clean Clothes campaign, we've given input into their position paper, which is the position paper they use to put pressure on the European Union in each legislative framework. And so as someone who comes from the South and who is working with informal workers in the South, it's a very northern perspective on enforcement. And so the way that the enforcement is thought about is really litigation. So really the piece that I wrote is the beginning of wanting to bring home worker organizations' voice and factory workers, right? I mean, we're doing a lot of work with the Asia Full Wage Alliance around informality in factories. That the enforcement mechanisms have to enable home workers and all workers in factories to know who they produce for and to be able to take it up with the unions or to, complain, etc. But as you say, the design of this has to be very, very carefully done. And I think the design has to be a participatory process. I mean, it's only workers themselves that know what is going to keep them safe and how they can report without losing their work. I mean, you also raise the issue of, I'm just looking here, whether there are laws in other countries that mean that there's a kind of transparency around where home workers are, or subcontracted workers. The issue is a very, very tricky one because in our experience, brands are very nervous of allowing home workers in their supply chains because it's much, much harder to track what's going on in the home or what's going on in workshops than it is in the factory. And so there's this very fine line that we tread between wanting to show that in many countries, a lot of the work happens outside of factories. And so it's a continuum of work. And so it's a false thing to say we must try and protect tier 1 factory workers and not think about the rest of the chain. Because as we've seen in COVID, I was looking at statistics this morning with the Asia Full Wage Alliance, that there's been an informalization of work during COVID. So there's a fine line between saying all workers are legitimate workers in the supply chain, including home workers, and asking for these workers to be made visible, because the risk is that the brands will say, we don't authorize homework, we ban homework. And then, of course, it just goes underground. So in the OECD guidance on the garment and footwear sector, there's a whole section on homework, but it starts, and it's actually quite a good section. And the Global Labour University had a big part in home workers having some kind of voice in how that was construed. But the problem with the section, it starts off and it says, if brands decide to authorize homework, then this is the way that they should treat home workers. So that's the tricky thing. So home workers are, the organizations we work with are undecided on whether home workers, whether there should be full transparency about where home workers are in the supply chain, because they fear losing their work. So perhaps one last comment on this is, just as we've done research on home workers and we've tried to map the supply chain from the bottom up, typically either home workers are quite scared to disclose the brands, and HomeNet South Asia has found people saying, we actually can't talk to you, we're too scared, we lose our work. And those that have talked, as they've sort of gone up from the bottom and they get to sort of tier 3 or so, they've had the contractors come to them and say, if you continue to do this, you will lose your work. So it's this really complex dynamic. I hope I've answered something of your question.
Thank you.
Sure, for sure. Thank you, Marlese. There is another question. Please raise your hand. I have a question about this. I know that we go work with the informal workers, no? Especially women. And we in Peru, we have, and I think that is maybe similar in other countries too, that we have this debate about informal sector and formal sector, no? That is the description that the government usually use. And we don't agree with that, because there is a lot of big companies that are in the formal sector, but they have in Peru at least around 15 or 20% of their workers in the in formal way, no? I mean, they subcontracting with informal small companies. So there is informality inside of the so-called formality. So my question is about those workers, no? And how they can be organized to be able to push for this kind of human rights due diligence mechanism, because sometimes they are just in the shadow. No, the big company say, I don't have any contract with them. I don't have any contract with the company that they work for. No, so there is these liars, no, that try to avoid their responsibility. So what could be your perspective around that topic? Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Luis. So just to sort of validate your perspective on Peru, that's widespread. So you've spoken about 15 to 20%, I think, of workers in the garment sector are informal, are outside of the factory in informal context, either as home workers or in workshops. And in Asia, that's even higher. So in most of the regions in India, certainly in the garment sector, it's up to 80% of workers are outside of the factory. I mean, there's a really, really good paper on that. And we've been gathering statistics on that in other countries. In Pakistan, it's about 40%. So it's very prevalent. And then to move to your question on how to organize, I mean, in many countries, home workers are organized, and the organizations are varying strength. So, for example, in India, in one of the regions, probably one of the strongest ones is in Tirupur, which is the knitwear. They talk about it as the t-shirt capital of the world. There are about 200 brands that make their t-shirts there. So that's in Tamil Nadu. And there's an organization that is organizing home workers, and it's now registering as a trade union. It is affiliated to the National Trade Union. So it's definitely possible. And I would say that there are also global structures. So very recently, there was an organization formed, HomeNet International. And so local affiliates or national affiliates in countries can affiliate to the global organization. And this organization supports organizations of informal home-based workers. Perhaps the last thing to say, and just on that, in Latin America, it's quite a fledgling regional body, but it is there. And in fact, Laura, your friend Laura, is the person within WeGo that's supporting the Latin American formation of home workers. I mean, perhaps the other thing to say is I think that we realize that it's important to be organizing at the different levels of the chain, but there has to be solidarity across the whole chain. And so there's a real need for home worker organizations to be connecting with trade unions at national level. And I know that in the Philippines, the home worker organization has done exactly that. And it's in fact with Benjamin's trade union. And the Benjamin's trade union give a lot of support to home worker organizations. Same in Pakistan, same. So that's part of where the power comes from, is all workers along the chain standing in solidarity. So I'm just seeing the comment in the chat on a few brands publishing supplier lists. I mean, it's true, of course, but it's not all the way down. It's tier 1 and in some cases tier 2. And I think the push needs to be that it's full transparency, sort of all the way down the chain.
Thank you. Thank you for those clarification. I don't know if there is any additional question or comment. Please raise your hand. I was thinking to just add some topic here is about the COVID pandemic. We saw in these circumstances how some brands they use their power to have this contract with the suppliers, and now in the COVID time they just don't follow the contract, or they use the act of God or force majeure to try to don't follow the contract, and in that regard a lot of workers lost their jobs. So we are going to talk deep about this topic in the next chapter of our course, but I would like to know your opinion about this in the context of this mandatory due diligence, because it could be important to have some kind of clause that regulate this contract between the brands and the supplier, in order that the brands don't take advantage of their power to the supplier. What do you think about that in the frame of the mandatory due diligence?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the subject of the contract is incredibly important. From what I understand at the moment, though, the debate is not there, unfortunately. So from what I understand, the debate is in 3 places. The one is how far down. So the mandatory due diligence, just for those people who might not know. So at the European Union level, it will be legislation that would make it mandatory for all corporations who are both registered in the country or who sell into the country to do a due diligence, like a forensic audit, to ensure that there are not environmental violations and human rights, namely labor rights violations, in their supply chains. So the debate, as I understand it, is really focusing on 3 things. And this is from Intel, from the Clean Clothes campaign. So the first issue is how far down the chain. Is it just tier 1 factories, or do we go further down the chain? And at the moment, at the national level, in Germany and France, it's just tier 1. The second issue is, what is the size of the companies that should be covered by this? Is it just the bigger companies in Europe, or is it also the SMEs? And then the third issue is around liability. So liability draws on the branch of law known as tort or delict, which is unlawful acts. So it's not in the realm of contract. And I think, Luis, you're raising a really important issue. The heart of the power relationships between the supplier and the brand is in the contract. And I think there hasn't been enough attention on that. So I guess the question would be, and that would be for everybody in the room, is to what extent can trade unions in the supplier countries, and particularly those that are members of industrial and the ITUC, to what extent do you think you could put pressure on the trade unions to be pushing for this in the EU legislation?
Yeah, that's totally right. Now in Peru, we have a progressive government who is trying to push more transparency in that regard, but there is not a big progress, no. And I'm sure in all the legislation about collective bargaining process, there is this mandatory this obligation of the company to show the information, no, the economic information, in order that the workers can make can negotiate, no. But in Peru, we have that law, but the companies just don't follow that. And since there is not an effective sanction, they don't show the information. No? So there is a lack of transparency.
Around the sanction, yeah. What is interesting is the Asia Floor Wage Alliance is bringing through national trade unions in a number of countries. So in India, in Pakistan, in I think Sri Lanka, and there's a fourth one, I think Indonesia. They're bringing cases at the national level on the basis that there should be joint employer liability that holds the brands liable for human rights violations at the national level in those countries. So that's very interesting. So they've started that legislation in 3 countries already. I mean, sorry, not legislation, court cases in 3 countries. And what I find encouraging about that is I don't know that we can hold our breath that we can only rely on legislation at the European level. I think it's got to be a kind of, I mean, these are legal and political issues, and they have to be fought at all levels, in supplier countries and in producer countries. Sorry, and that's the same thing. Sorry, buyer countries and supplier countries.
Yeah, that's totally true.
So it would be interesting to hear who else is in the room and where you come from. So I briefly saw a picture of Gift. You had your camera on briefly. I'd love to know where you're from.
So somebody want to share a small brief presentation? Not all at the same time, please. Go ahead, Benji.
Yeah, just another quick question to Marlese. You mentioned the EU a while ago. So what do you think are the prospects for HRDD or mandatory due diligence legislation at the level of the EU and in other countries? Are there any prospects for that in the US? Anything they're talking about there?
Now, there's an interesting question. So, I'm reminded that very few United States corporations signed the Bangladesh Accord. And labor law has so been eroded in the US. I mean, US workers themselves have got so little protection that I can't imagine that that's going to be possible in the US, particularly where the US is politically. I mean, what I do know is at least there are a couple of very strong civil society organizations in the US. So perhaps it's not going to be legislation, but certainly there are organizations who are putting pressure on their brands, in different ways. I mean, the Workers' Rights Consortium being one of them, and what's the name of it now? Global, help it, Lira. I've forgotten what it's called now. That's changed its name. It was a sort of amalgamation of two.
GLF, the Global Labor Forum. It's ILRF before, right? Yeah. So.
Exactly. Exactly. So, I mean, I know they're working very closely with the Asia Floor Wage Alliance to put pressure on brands to pay us a once-off COVID amount to workers in their supply chains. Yeah, I don't think there's much hope in the near future for legislation in the USA.
But at the EU, will there be something similar to what the French and the German supply chain law? Is it something being talked about at the EU?
Definitely. So they're expecting the Commission. The process is that the Commission's going to be. Sorry, Lero, were you wanting to?
No, no, it was just a question to you. But is it that the US perhaps is using more the trade to kind of push for that? It's putting much stronger emphasis on the labor clauses and so on to push for the same. But I'm not a lawyer, so I think perhaps it would be interesting. But it would be interesting to get also your perspective in what would be more powerful, or is it a question of either or? Do we need both, or when it comes from the pressure that should come from the developed countries? I mean.
Yeah, thank you for that intervention. You're quite right, and I don't think it's either or. I think I think we've got to look at a whole range of mechanisms. So you're quite right, and I think in the USA they're definitely using the trade mechanisms. As far as I know, I know I listened to a very interesting thing by Lance Compa recently on it, just on some of the new mechanisms. So I guess we'll wait to see if they're more effective. But you're quite right. So just to come back to the EU, so the process now is that the European Commission is going to publish what they call a legislative framework, and the hope is that ultimately this will be a directive. So if it's a directive, it means that it directs, and I'm aware I've got European, Italy would know the European context better than I do. So if it's a directive, it would mean that every member state has to then have its own due diligence legislation. So once in November, it's expected in November, the Commission has published this legislative framework. Then the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament would then negotiate for the final text. The Parliament's already got a report out on what it thinks that legislation should look like. And you can imagine there is a lot of lobbying going on. So there's lobbying by corporations, there's lobbying by civil society, and there's lobbying by trade unions. So there's a group of 8 civil society organizations there. They're the big ones: Amnesty, the Clean Clothes Campaign, Earth Africa, no, not Earth, what they're called? Earth Life, right? Oxfam, ECCJ, that are Brussels-based NGOs, and they're the kind of civil society voice, and working quite closely with the ETUC, the European arm of the International Trade Union Confederation. So there's definitely going to be legislation, and as Luis and Edlera and I were talking earlier, the countries where there's already legislation, or such as France and Germany and Norway, and there's also legislation that's in draft form in the Netherlands, there are discussions in Italy. Those countries' MPs, there's a lot of pressure on those countries' representatives in the European Parliament to push for the European law, because they don't want, for the mandatory due diligence legislative framework, and because they don't want their corporations to get an unfair advantage, because they now have laws in their national context. So there's definitely going to be law. It's a question of how strong or weak it is. And there's just a ton of lobbying going on at the moment.
No, thank you. Just a quick comment about what is happening here in the US. One of the big news is about the USMCA, this agreement between Mexico and Canada. And they are doing some progress. Just yesterday, they have this statement from the General Motor Union in Mexico that through the work with the Department of Labor here, they reach a new union and a new collective bargaining. So that is a big advance in just short period of time. So I think here the lights are on that kind of labor clause, in the free trade, in the frame of the free trade agreement. There is an interesting complaint about gender discrimination for immigrants that is now in process. Is from Latino immigrants here in the U.S., a woman, so we will see what happens with that. No, but it sounds like maybe could be another approach. No, another different results than in the past. No, so we hope that could be like that. So there is another question, please, or comment. Yes.
On the discussion we had just in the previous workshop that started just before yours, Marlese, about we were discussing with Stephanie this the approach that when it comes to small and medium-sized enterprises, there should be this transition and perhaps a bit more a bit more support for them to comply with all the regulations that come from mandatory due diligence. But these are often in our countries also the companies that are often bordering the informal or totally informal, at least informal employment relations. So they are kind of one step before the home-based workers, I suppose. And I wonder, of course, what's your approach on that? What needs to happen with this kind of enterprises that find it more difficult to comply with certain labor legislation and environmental regulations too? And then when it comes to auditing requirements, what kind of documentation they had to prepare. And Stephanie was referring to also some sort of cost sharing schemes for these small and medium-sized enterprises. But in your vast experience with home-based workers, who is usually subcontracting the work to home-based workers? Is it these small and medium-sized enterprises that kind of put it even further? And how would you see the kind of, the logic of implementing the mandatory due diligence, how that should trickle down, from this semi-formal companies then to home-based workers? So just what are your thoughts on that discussion? Because we were also, my thinking was also, when does it come a point where you say, perhaps you don't have to be in the market anymore if you can't comply with certain basic protection for workers and environmental standards? Why should every company operate, even at these huge costs for people and for the environment? So if we can get your thoughts on that.
Sure, you raised a lot. So just to be sure, are you, as I understand it, the debate in the European Union is whether the German and French and European SMEs should also have to comply. And so is your question around those SMEs, or do you mean in the supplier countries?
I think it's the supplier countries, particularly since the application of the mandatory, that's the discussion, right? Like how down the supply chain should they go?
Yes, I'm with you. So the way that home workers are contracted are different in different countries, and even in the same country and the same city, there are multiple ways. So sometimes they are contracted directly by the factory. It's either a supervisor in the factory that would sort of supply, contract a network of people. And so just to remind people that home workers sometimes are contracted when there's a lot of work and it's over a season. And so it's kind of a flexible labor force. And that's why, it's contracted to them. Sometimes they're permanent in that it's just a way of reducing costs for the factory. So sometimes it's a factory. Sometimes it goes tier 1, tier 2, and then it would be a workshop like you talking about, a kind of SME, and that SME would subcontract to the home workers. And then sometimes it's even like, for example, in Thailand, in the fishing industry, the factory would send a whole consignment to the home worker. She would do the tasks she wants to do, and then she subcontracts to other home workers. But the important piece here is she's like a team leader, and she doesn't take a cut on their goods. So she's not, in that sense, an informal enterprise herself. So in India, the legislation says if you've got above 20 people in your workshop, you're covered by the law. But if you're below 20 people, you're not covered by the law. And of course, the vast majority of people are in the smaller enterprises. So, I mean, personally, I think it's got to be covered by everybody. We can't, it's so dangerous when we start saying some workers are covered, but others don't have to be covered. And often the way that the supply chain is structured is exactly because of the brand's pricing structure, then has an effect on how the chain is structured all the way down to homework. So my own position would be it's got to be all workers in the supply chain. Of course, what is missing in the mandatory due diligence legislation is that the procurement practices of the brands are not being tackled. So, I mean, that's the key thing, of course. It's not just the suppliers or the SMEs who are not paying properly. They're not paying properly in part because of the pricing structure of the procurement contracts from the brands. So I don't know if other people have got other thoughts on this. So Tia, you've got your camera on, so I'd love to hear where you are, and Anjali, where you from?
Yeah, hi. I'm from India. So thank you first of all for the lecture. I mean, this discussion was really helpful, and so I was just listening to the fact that you mentioned about the Factory Act, and also something that's nationalized as well. So that's something that I still have to read about it. So that was interesting for me. But I also had one more question. Is that I'm doing a study on digital technology, which is everybody's talking about it. But how are the female workers? Because a lot of domestic work right now, it's not app based, but yes, there are a lot of beauticians who are app based workers. But it's time to come when even domestic workers are going to be app based workers. And then that comes another deal altogether in terms of protecting domestic workers in terms of when they go under the gig economy. So I was just wondering, I mean, I don't really have any thoughts on it, but I just thought maybe to ask you if you have any thoughts on the same.
So it's interesting, just first to say there's a really brilliant ILO publication on digital work that if you don't know about it, it's quite recent. It's definitely worth a read.
Okay.
It's by Uma Rani, and I can send it to you if you can't find it. Okay.
Okay.
So interesting, in my country, domestic workers, and certainly in the States, domestic workers are, there are platforms for domestic workers now. It operates quite differently to what I saw in the States, where I lived for a while. So in the States, the one that I used, it was independent contractors really that were posting their own prices. So you'd have a range from $20 to $100. And so they would obviously pay a cut to the platform. Whereas in South Africa, it's very different. I mean, they are actually controlling the domestic workers, the rates, the specials, the everything. So, I mean, it may as well be an Uber. And so what is quite interesting in the context of South Africa is there's a group that's working with the domestic worker trade union around creating an app that is owned by domestic workers themselves. And certainly that's something that we're being sort of challenged by the International Domestic Workers Federation, and also by our board, and Uma Rani sits on our board, to be looking at platforms and particularly how informal some of the traditional occupations are going to shift because of platforms. So yeah, I don't know that I'm answering your question, but I think you're quite right. You've got to get ahead of that, particularly in female, work sectors.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to know if there is another comment or question. If not,
So hi
oh.
Luis, just to Marlese. Marlese, can you write that on the chat, the name of the author you mentioned? Sorry, I can't get the name. Sorry.
Thanks for sharing.
I mean, I can send it to Luis as well. Luis, I don't know if we can post it. I mean, it's a really, really good report. And I think some quite useful typologies and framing for us to be thinking about digital work going forward.
Yeah, of course. I can share if you send me that, I can send that paper.
I can actually, you know what, if you give me a minute, I can actually get it now because I think she sent it to me, I think. So I listened to it at the Labor Law Research Network conference, with a presentation on it. Really quickly, I think I can get it for you.
Could I also drop my email so maybe I could ask you a few questions?
Sure.
You can also write to Marlese from the Diversity platform. So she's under instructors. If you write through the platform, it gets directly to her email. So that's also possible.
Okay.
So here's the ILO report in the chat.
Thanks a lot, Marlese.
Sure.
Sorry. Thanks, Marlese, for sharing this document, but also for sharing your time with us. I think it was a wonderful conversation. And thank you so much for that. And thank you to everyone for their question and comments. So remember, just a quick reminder that we have another workshops this coming Friday, tomorrow. No? Tomorrow we have 2 workshops, and also the next week we have at least 3 workshops, I think. So please check your emails and sign for those workshops if you are interested in. Okay, thank you so much to everyone. And again, thank you, Marlese.
Thank you. It's been a very rich and stimulating conversation.